Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Bunty Chand, and I work for the Asia Society in India. And we are delighted to welcome you to a very special program this afternoon. We have with us Duncan who has written a marvelous book on Alibaba, the house that Jack Ma built. And it's available for sale at the back of the room, firstly. And a special prize for members of the Asia Society. And our moderator for this afternoon is Neeraj Kulshresht, who's Chief of Operations at the Bombay Stock Exchange. And the conversation today is part of Asia Society's Meet the Author series, which aims to bring freshest perspectives from writers across Asia as they engage in dialogue about their recent publications and the art of writing, and of course, all the knowledge that they have as they're writing these books. And given that I have the floor, I'm going to say a few words about the Asia Society. So we are a 60-year-old organization, and we have 12 global centers that promote collaboration and exchange across and within Asia Pacific. We work in the areas of business and policy, arts and culture, and we use creative formats to present cross-disciplinary perspectives, fresh insights, informed ideas with diverse speakers, and always an independent and non-partisan view on Asian and world affairs. So what we hope is that through dialogue with leaders, thinkers, and citizens, we can address some of the vital issues which face Asia on the global stage, and we hope that we can create awareness and effect change. In India, we have surged past our 10th year mark, and we think we have contributed to the public discourse in the city on policy, business, arts, and culture. And I would especially like to thank our corporate, individual, and patron members, because it is your financial support and your presence here that keeps us operational in Mumbai, because we do raise all our money locally. And now I have a little quiz so that our speakers this afternoon can know who you are. So with a quick show of hands, how many of you in our audience today shop on an e-commerce platform? Wow. What, about 80%? 70%, I'd say. How many of you believe India can become a cashless society? Okay, that's like 50%. And now just a brief word of introduction to our speakers. Duncan, as you may have, if you've read the back cover of his book, is the founder, investor, and leading advisor on China's dynamic technology and consumer sectors. And he has written this marvelous book, Alibaba, the house that Jack built, and he has been based in and out of China since 1994. So if anybody knows China well, he does. And he has previously worked with Morgan Stanley, and he currently runs a company called BDA China, which is a consulting company on China. And he's a senior China policy advisor to institutional investors, corporations, and governments, and also an early stage investor in a number of technology ventures. And he's an independent director at of Bangkok Bank in Shanghai, and he is a global member of the Asia Society Board of Trustees. And I did also want to say that Asia Society runs a program called the Asian Game Changers Award, and Duncan reminded me about it yesterday. And the Asia Society, when it instituted the awards, the first award that was given was to Jack Ma. And the next year, we gave the award to Xiaomi's founder. And what is interesting is that the Xiaomi founder was not so happy with Jack Ma. We happened to mention it to him, and he was not so pleased. And our moderator for this afternoon is Neeraj, who has been the Chief Operations Officer at Bombay Stock Exchange, and he's responsible for trading, listing, membership, and IT operations. And he is a member of the Executive Management Committee of the Bombay Stock Exchange and on the boards of India Clearing Corporation and Asia Index Private Limited. And he has 20 years of experience in capital markets, and he has been at Morgan Stanley, National Stock Exchange, and is from Delhi University. And now I'm going to invite Duncan to say a few words, and this will be followed by a conversation with Neeraj.
Thanks very much. Oh, need a mic. Can you hear me now? Yes. Good morning. Oops, it's in a weird mode. We'll fix that in a second. So thanks for that introduction. Again, my name is Duncan Clark. It's a pleasure to be back in Mumbai. When I was at Morgan Stanley, I used to come quite regularly down here from Hong Kong. In fact, Morgan Stanley had a very ill-advised mutual fund that was being launched my first time. So I couldn't admit to being from Morgan Stanley then. It was a very controversial time. But I'm now back as an author of this book. So thank you for those of you, quite a few I spoke to already have copies with them. We'll get it going in a second. Technology. Yes, okay, thank you. So I'm just going to have a quick run through some themes which I think might help set the stage for our discussion, and it's an honor to be here in such august company. This rather feels like the cave in Alibaba, or Aladdin's cave perhaps, so it's an appropriate venue. But as we're talking about markets, this is a very appropriate place for us to be today. But I just wanted to say a few words. This is not, oh, turn it on. This is my fault. Okay, got it. Don't worry. Last month, there was one day that we know changed the world. It's really, the ramifications of this are still being felt. I'm not talking about the election of a certain former business person or current business person in the United States. I'm talking about Singles Day. So 11/11/2016. It was a day which, of course, in the West and other places is for remembering fallen soldiers and veterans. But in China, it's celebrated as a new way that single people, and frankly anybody else, can engage in some retail therapy. We all think of Valentine's Day as when happy couples get together, but there are more single people often than happy couples. And Alibaba realized that by creating a holiday, 1111, single people in a line, in a queue, they could create an excuse, frankly, for a shopping festival. And you'll see the cat. This is in Shenzhen in China, just across the border from Hong Kong, which is not Alibaba's home. It's actually home to Alibaba's chief rival, Tencent. So it was a very provocative move that Alibaba put this festival there, because Alibaba faces a competitor called JD.com, which is invested by Tencent. But anyway, they moved the show to Shenzhen. In my book, the opening scene is actually talking about the festival last year, which was held in Beijing in the iconic diving facility from the 2008 Olympics. Anyway, a lot of symbolism around this festival, which is why I'm talking about it. In just 24 hours, Alibaba sold close to $18 billion worth of goods, which I believe is more than a year in the Indian e-commerce market. I mean, that's not a typical day in China, by the way. That is a huge concentration of sales. This is on the Tmall platform, Alibaba's flagship, if you will, website. And, it was generating over 650 million packages. So on that day, and the following days actually, over 2.5 million couriers were involved in actually delivering all of these goods. In fact, in my office in Beijing and various others, you couldn't actually get into the office. There were so many packages piled up high. And so I think it's important, though, to think about what this means for China, and putting aside the sort of materialistic aspects of this, but in terms of the shift of China from a kind of made in China model to increasingly a consumed in China market. This is what the Chinese government wants actually to happen. If China was to continue to try to make things and export to the world, it's basically running out of world, right? I mean, we all know how much of things today are made in China. But to keep the consumption going in China, to generate this shift in the economy, Alibaba flew in a number of celebrities Here you can see Kobe Bryant, both of the Beckhams. They're trying to do this is the symbol for 1111. I'm not sure it works very well. It might be, I think that's actually an insult in Spain, but anyway, we have to be careful. 1111. So they're trying to create a new paradigm, which is basically e-commerce is no longer electronic commerce, it's entertainment commerce, that's in my word. What they do, this is in the run-up to the midnight of 11/11, where they want people to go online, stream a show, and actually watch celebrities, and then from midnight, people can start placing their orders. 82% of all these orders were placed using smartphones, by the way. So people are using their smartphones, they're in some cases holding up the smartphone to scan from the screen, or shaking their phones, playing games. So the idea is keep people entertained and keep people shopping for 24 hours. And I managed to get a selfie there, but I think I unfortunately didn't get close to Scarlett Johansson. But anyway, you can see Jack, and Jack is somebody I've known since 1999. And you know, here you see him, I actually had some hair gel for the first time ever. He's getting a bit more stylish now because he's investing in Hollywood and so on, but he's still Jack. We'll talk a lot about this unusual figure. So, quick preview, and then we can go quickly to the questions. I just wanted to everybody to understand, why is Alibaba so impactful? Why is its position so dominant with 80% of the market? And I think, in Jack's words, this is the iron triangle. So they bring together e-commerce, finance, and logistics. And this is what I call the architecture of trust in China. The rarest commodity in China today, other than fresh air, and those of you from Delhi know all about that. I think Beijing and Delhi are in a sad competition in that one. But trust, China is actually a low trust society. And of course, this stems back to tradition when people would trust within their family. And then perhaps within the party, when it was very much a sort of hard communist country in a sense, everything was provided by your employer. You would meet your spouse through your employer, your education for your children, everything was provided. But that iron rice bowl, if you will, has broken down. Now, increasingly, the private sector is coming. You have to deal with strangers, people you don't know, outside the family, outside your work unit. And so actually, in each of these three areas, the offline sort of incumbent players were not very efficient. So let's take e-commerce. Commerce, in terms of retail in China, was never very good, frankly, in the last 20 years or so, at the beginning when I moved there. State-owned shops often were very reluctant to serve you. They thought you might get the carpet dirty if you came into the shop. And it would be a hassle for them. They'd be having their lunch break. And so there was no love lost for Chinese to shop online. This is very important to understand why Chinese shop online to a much greater degree than Americans. Because there really was nothing left to cling to in the sense of, in the US, and of course in India, many other places, we have very good traditional shops with long tradition of service. Obviously, organized retail in India is also an opportunity for e-commerce because it's much lower, perhaps, than in Western markets. But in e-commerce and also in finance, banks, Chinese individuals have never had checkbooks. Private companies have never been given loans because the banks are all state-owned and their purpose is to lend to state companies. And also in logistics, the Chinese post office for a long time wasn't very reliable, and so courier companies have sprung up. So in each of these areas, you can see in e-commerce, finance, and logistics, a whole new set of companies run by entrepreneurs have sprung up. And Alibaba is really at the forefront of bringing them all together. And just so you know, for next year, or perhaps the following, we'll see a new player on the scene, which is Alibaba's Ant Financial unit. Ant Financial already is valued, I think it's the highest valued private company in the world, about $75 billion. And that includes what I just showed you, the finance side of the triangle for Alibaba, which is Alipay. And of course, you know, in India, Paytm is an investment from here. So you'll start to see the international ramifications of this growth. Why Ant? In China, actually, people describe Ant cities. For example, north of Beijing, a lot of students who can't afford to buy their own home or even rent their own apartment live together in what's been described as sort of ant hills, you know. And turning this from a negative to a positive, this idea of everybody working together, the little guys getting together, has been this name that even small individuals, when they come together, can actually change the world. This is very much part of the philosophy of Jack Ma, and you'll hear that in the book also. He talks a lot about shrimp. He refers to Bubba Gump. There are many whales in the ocean, or not so many whales in the ocean, it's hard to track them down, but there are many shrimp. So this sense of almost a democratic, frankly, driven revolution in the economy is part and parcel of Alibaba. I put this up here because you'll be hearing more about this company. It is planning to have a listing in 2017, if not beyond. Anyway, very quickly, just to run through a few other points. The book includes a chapter really on this province. It's quite hard to pronounce. Much of China is hard to pronounce. This Zhejiang province. I mean, China recently, in September, hosted, and I think Premier Modi was there also, of course, the G20 event. By the way, that's the first time China ever hosted the G20, and they chose to host it not in Beijing or Shanghai, but in Zhejiang, in Hangzhou, which is Jack Ma's hometown. On this map, you can see various, it's not very clear, but various items are made in Zhejiang. It's part of the Made in China story. Here we see electric bicycles. A number of these products, of course, will be available in India. Even if you try and put tariffs on them, they'll find their way in. Dresses, electric bikes, socks. These are the cities which make single products. China has 2 sock cities. One makes the left sock and one makes the right sock. Now, China has a problem, actually. They have too many of these industrial cities that actually compete too much with each other. And this is part of the understanding of why Jack started Alibaba, was he wanted to help merchants, manufacturers find markets. His motto, actually, still to this day for Alibaba, is making business easier, more simple. And so in this case, you can see these single product towns sprouted up, including a money town, actually, Wenzhou, on the coast of Zhejiang province, has long had a tradition of innovation in money, in lending. We could say that's also dodgy or it's innovative, depending on your perspective. But we've actually seen what the curbside lending model, which has actually reformed to some degree the banks, has emerged from Wenzhou. Also logistics, you can see people packing parcels there. There's a town about 100 kilometers from Hangzhou called Tonglu. 3 of the 4 courier companies in China are based in that one town, and nearly all of their business came out of Alibaba. So imagine if FedEx, DHL, and UPS were all based in one village, actually. And actually the people founding those companies were related to each other, or classmates. It's a very unusual situation, but that's part of the Iron Triangle. You can see the money aspect from Wenzhou, the logistics side, also the town of Yiwu, which, we don't really hear about Yiwu, but 98% of the world's anything, frankly, Christmas decorations or toothbrushes, for example. This morning, I hope you all got up and brushed your teeth. I'd venture that toothbrush is made in China and made in Zhejiang, and it's certainly very likely to be traded in Yiwu. Yiwu has an international airport. It's a big merchant gathering place for people from the Middle East around the world. And so this is Zhejiang. Zhejiang is a thriving commercial entrepreneurial province that's hard to pronounce, but we need to know more about Zhejiang. By the way, it's now connecting with the world in new ways. Hangzhou, for example, where Alibaba is based, now has a non-stop flight to San Francisco. So I made this joke recently. Somebody was telling me, well, he was explaining Hangzhou is a 1-hour drive from Shanghai, or 1-hour train from Shanghai. I said, no, Shanghai is 1 hour from Hangzhou. I think we need to reorientate our understanding. And of course, many successful Indian companies like TCS and others are in Hangzhou. Anyway, but the point of the toothbrush. When I first met Jack in his apartment in Hangzhou in 1999, he was there with 17 others. There were 18 co-founders. By the way, 6 of the founders of Alibaba are women. So 1/3 of the co-founders are women, including Jack's wife. But when I was using the bathroom, actually, I saw 2 mugs stuffed with toothbrushes like this, 18 toothbrushes. It was a sign of, these people were working around the clock. There was a really strong entrepreneurial spirit that has always driven the company. Jack did not allow people to live more than 10 minutes away from the office. So this was a 24/7 sort of thing. But if we go back, when I did my research in Wenzhou, in 1982, the Wenzhou government invited people into the office, the government offices, people who were involved in trade, making money. And they were all arrested. 1982, this was still considered speculation. This was a long time before Alibaba was founded. But the following year, 1983, the government in that city summoned, again, people involved in trade in, and they all carried toothbrushes in their pockets. because in Chinese prison, they don't give you a toothbrush, so you better carry on. So as a habit, as a foreigner in China, I think it's good to always have a toothbrush with me. But the point is that that's when things started to change. Those people were not arrested, and the previous lot were released. So risk-taking, to be a successful entrepreneur, embracing risk. The risk of these people in the early 1980s in Zhejiang, people were not waiting for a signal that it was okay to make money, that it was okay to trade in goods, to make goods outside of the state. So Zhejiang has, I think, the longest tradition in China of this. So it's no accident that Alibaba really comes from Zhejiang. It really represents this risk-taking spirit. And internet entrepreneurs take risks too, particularly in China, where dealing with the government, sometimes particularly about information and so on, is sensitive. But when I did my research, I came across this story that nobody had really written. It was a local newspaper in Australia. I found reference to this guy, David Morley, who, by the way, is my age. He's kept his hair. This was in 1980. And Jack Ma here is 15 years old. Jack Ma, if you really boil it down, is actually a tour guide. He became an English teacher, but essentially, he's very proud of his town. He's very proud of his country. We just saw a few months ago in Hangzhou, Jack was effectively tour guide now to people like President Obama or your Prime Minister. The B20, which came before the G20, the business 20 leaders, was really hosted by Jack. But here he is in 1980. Again, so Chinese reforms just beginning. Foreign tourists just allowed to come in. The previous year, I think only 500 came to his city. In this year, 1980, it was 30-something thousand. Amongst them was David Morley, his brother, sister, and parents. Now, David came from New South Wales in Australia, a small town in Australia. And David's father was a committed socialist. His mother was a member of the Australian Communist Party. They were there to show their children a worker's paradise. They actually went to Cuba the following year. But Jack would wake up every morning at 5 o'clock and go to talk to tourists who were arriving, what is today the Shangri-La Hotel in Hangzhou, and offer his services for free as a tour guide to show them the city. And this is a way how he practices English. And to understand why Jack has become so successful internationally, well, you have to communicate without relying on interpreters. He's also got an amazing ability to communicate, to tell jokes. He is a comedian. And so he was an entertaining tour guide, and so he ended up showing the family around, and they became friends, David and Jack. They became pen pals. And in the book, I have an embarrassing early letter from Jack in English, which the Morley family would send back corrections to, double-spaced, so they could actually improve his English. And in the end, the relationship flourished, and Jack was supported by the Morley family, by this communist and socialist sort of family. They actually bought him his first apartment. This is not where he founded Alibaba. This was a few years before that, but it gives you a sense, how was he able to take a risk like that? Here he is standing very proudly in front of a microwave and a refrigerator. Those things were very prized back then. This was, I think it was called the big three. So a microwave, fridge, and washing machine. Those were the things that everybody desired. Today in China, I think it's a Maserati, a Gulfstream. No, not everybody's that wealthy, but things have moved on in China. You probably have a microwave in your Gulfstream is probably the new thing. But you can see how proud Jack is, Again, he went on, he was very bad at maths. We don't think of Chinese as being bad at maths, but Jack was. Jack got 1 out of 120 the first time he took the national exam in maths. I mean, I think you get 10 for signing your name, surely. He must have misspelled his name. So he's famously bad at maths. He has no background in engineering or technology. So how did he get his lucky break? Well, it turned out this connection with the Morley family was quite instrumental. So I just thought it was a sort of ironical, of course, because Ken Morley, the father, got to see Jack's early success before he passed away, unfortunately. But he did see already Jack becoming a very wealthy man. And the irony was not lost that this socialist and communist couple from Australia had basically enabled somebody who's now Asia's man. So a little historical detail there. But Jack also had a lucky break in 1997, and this is when I first met Jerry Yang from Yahoo, came to Beijing. Jack had failed at this point. This is Jack, Jerry Yang in the middle, and Jack's wife, Kathy, again, a co-founder of Alibaba. Jack had founded a business as a translator after he stopped being a teacher. He could hardly cover his expenses. Even as a translation business, he would still sell things on the street. He would sell plastic carpets. He would go to a company and say, let me translate your brochure into English. they might say no. He's like, what about a plastic carpet for your lobby? You know, so he's a hustler in a way. He knew how to sell. But that business didn't take off. He then launched his first internet business after visiting the United States in '95. It did okay, but it was taken over by the local government. Here, Jack is actually now working for the central government, for the Ministry of Commerce. Very unhappy, building websites for them, knowing that the government would never really get the internet right. But they said to him one day, can you take this guy out to the Great Wall, somebody called Jerry Yang? And this was when Yahoo was really, of course, today we think of Yahoo as embarrassing. You know, if you have Yahoo Mail, you apologize to people. But then this was the bee's knees. So as a result of this chance meeting, and again, Jack being a tour guide, in this case, very proud, showing the Beijing and the Great Wall, 7 years later, Yahoo would invest $1 billion in Alibaba. So Jack had not launched Alibaba at this point, but this relationship endured. And Yahoo ended up buying 40% of Alibaba at a critical time, which allowed them to defeat eBay. And Jack became an icon. So there's an element of luck, because people ask, like, how can I be successful as an entrepreneur? And you know, there's a lot of randomness, but there's also how you make your own luck. So I tried to sort of tease that out in the story. We'll get to questions as quickly as possible. Alibaba is expanding around the world. I understand they're opening an office in India soon. Obviously, they've made investments through the US. They're up and down the West Coast. We could also add in Europe. They're in Milan and Paris and Munich and London. So in developed markets, in the Western markets, they're not trying to go head to head with, say, Amazon, but they are sourcing. They're sourcing goods. As we saw on that 11/11 festival, a good chunk, perhaps I think a third of buyers were buying international goods, brands. So Alibaba wants to bring premium Western products to China. It's also, though, targeting other markets. Let me just go to one. It's also increasingly selling in places like Russia, where actually it's the #1 website for e-commerce, AliExpress. It's translating all these items that were available in China for over 100 languages. Actually, I'm fortunate because my book is selling in these places, about 16 languages, where people want to know more about Alibaba. People are buying the made in China, the factory China prices. So you've got that going on in the emerging markets, but in the West, as I was saying, you know, Jack is courting the West, whether it be President Obama last year in the Philippines, where President Obama was interviewing Jack on stage, which was interesting. And Jack had a private lunch at the White House recently. I wonder whether that was about a job for President Obama, or maybe his daughter. I think she's looking for an internship. Here we see Justin Trudeau from Canada. Now, Trudeau in Chinese sounds like Tudou, which is potato. So Chinese call him Little Potato, because they know his father, Pierre Trudeau, his late father. But they're holding lobsters. So these are lobsters that are coming from Canada directly to China and will be sold on this Tmall site, in the Canadian pavilion of Tmall. And imagine, you know, that's not cheap, right? So we're seeing air-freighted, ice-packed lobsters. We're seeing it also from cherries from Washington State and other places. So there's an opportunity increasingly to achieve that China dream, is the promise here, that you can sell through Alibaba to these emerging consumers. Here, Mark Zuckerberg with Jack in Tsinghua University. Now, Mark Zuckerberg is learning Chinese, but I can say that Jack's English, I think, will always be better than Mark Zuckerberg's Chinese, unless he quits his day job. He's a busy man. And here, the now late, sort of ex-Prime Minister of Italy, launching another festival, 9/9, the Wine and Spirits Festival. Another holiday like 11/11. 9 and wine sound the same in Chinese, actually. 酒 and 酒. So the idea of getting Chinese to drink more, as well as buy more. And Jack, of course, has actually purchased 3 chateaux in Bordeaux, a wine negotiating company. He's also buying, I think, in Italy. Probably he's going to business, I would imagine, with the now unemployed Italian Prime Minister. It's funny how many of these people, all these politicians are like, you know, it's out of date. But Jack is also, as I quickly showed you, involved with people like this guy, and increasingly investing in Hollywood. So Alibaba's an entertainment company now. It recently invested in Amblin Entertainment, Steven Spielberg's entertainment company. But if you go to the movies, you will see Alibaba pictures flash up at the beginning, because it's no longer just an e-commerce company. Its origins are still there, and Jack likes to say we are not an e-commerce company, but they are trying to be beyond that, in finance, in entertainment. One of the reasons, by the way, that they're trying to get away from their original e-commerce business is piracy. There's been a lot of pirated goods available on merchants who are selling. Over 9 million merchants sell on Alibaba's websites, and they sell whatever they want. That's caused problems. So by going closer to the brands and also going into things like entertainment and data, cloud computing. Alibaba's getting away from those problems that have plagued their model. Okay, I think we're going to quickly go to some questions, maybe just a few. One last, Xi Jinping here, who, by the way, just announced he's going to be speaking at Davos in January. Interesting. China is now, seems to be picking up the standard bearer for globalization and trade. In a bizarre world we live in right now. But this is in 2007 when then Shanghai Party Secretary Xi Jinping was visiting Alibaba. The last chapter of the book is called Icon or Icarus. Jack is an icon, partly for having defeated eBay and so on. But like Icarus, as he moves into areas, not only films, but also news, banking, he's had some entanglements with the state. So like Icarus, is he flying too close to the sun or Sun King here? A bad joke is if he needs to buy a pair of wax and feather wings, like Icarus would have needed, it's all available on Alibaba's website, so you can get everything there. Just an interesting thing, perhaps in India the same. This is from my Chinese book tour. I'm one of over 300 books about Jack in Chinese, by the way. The guy is like demigod status, Just one floor of a bookshop will be dedicated to the success studies. This 成功学 is like the elite, business elite or success studies. And I'm sure we have similar things in India as well. Not just Indian, or in this case Chinese heroes, but also global heroes, including Jack's icon, Jack Welch, for example. So it's interesting that these are the new heroes of China. I mean, of course, there's still, nominally China is a communist country, but increasingly this consumerism, this entrepreneurialism is the new creed, particularly for the next generation. And as I said, internationally, I think what's interesting about Jack is that his story resonates. It's sort of the made in China version of an American dream. But the fact that it's not made in America, I think is interesting, because it gives hope, I think, and inspiration, including we have some young entrepreneurs in the room who want to do their own ventures in India who are saying it doesn't have to be all be made in Silicon Valley. This technology is global, and the power is global. Okay, should we move to our Q&A? Because I think I've taken way too much time. So thank you. Thanks, Niraj.
Thank you. I think it's interesting and extremely overwhelming to have a guy here speaking about Jack Ma, and the only person supposedly who knows more about Jack Ma is probably his wife. I mean, that's the way I see it.
She's had a few words with me, let me tell you.
Incidentally, the earlier presentation that he made, I think a lot of my questions have also been answered.
Oh, sorry.
But then, that's the magic of the guy. So, with all the facts that you've mentioned in the book, that he was bad at math,
Yep.
he failed twice in high school,
Yep.
got his first computer at 33, is 5 feet tall, was rejected by KFC and other employers.
By the way, he now owns KFC China. So
precisely. So, are you a fiction writer selling fairy tales?
Good question. When I pitched this book, they're like, this is a true story, right? I think had it been fiction, people would have said, this is impossible. Come back with something more realistic. But, I mean, of course, there's a risk, by the way, in over-dramatizing Jack's rags to riches thing. Particularly recently, he's quite powerful, connected, the government is involved in different ways. But the origins certainly are remarkable. I mean, he did struggle. And in China, if you're not good at maths, if you didn't do well in this horrendously difficult national exam where the competition is intense, they'll redirect flights, as I think in Korea and elsewhere. Everything rides on this one exam. If you're not good at that, like Jack, I mean, he had to try on his only third attempt to get into university. And that, to a great degree, would predetermine his place. And if you look at his rivals or his peers in the internet, they're more like a Mark Zuckerberg. In terms of Mark Zuckerberg, we know went to Harvard, famously dropped out. But Jeff Bezos went to Princeton, had worked on Wall Street. Similarly in China, the founders of the portals had some been to MIT or they'd been to Tsinghua University. So it's a very unusual story that Jack could somehow come from behind in that. So there's an element of fiction to it, or it's certainly a fairy tale, like
true?
Alibaba, the tale.
Fair point. So my next question is about why this title? Because the first house that he built, I mean, as you rightly mentioned, was actually presented to him by David Morley.
The Australian communist, yeah.
So why the house that Jack Ma built?
Well, again, I think it has that fairy tale element. Of course, it resonates in the West. This is known throughout Europe, this sort of fairy tale of the house that Jack built. It's a repetitive tale, actually. But actually, the topic in Chinese, the title in Chinese is The 102-Year Dream of Jack Ma. Why 102 years? Well, remember, Jack founded Alibaba in 1999. And within a few years, he said, you know what, if we go for 102 years, we will have spanned 3 centuries, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd century. So he's adopted that as their official target, to live 102 years. And meeting some of the great dynastic companies here, like Tata and so on, who are even older than that, you can often see Jack is very interested in companies that have lasted a long time. But what's important about that is that in China, we often think of the 5-year plan or the 10-year plan as being from the government, whereas entrepreneurs were very short-term. Jack is turning that on its head and saying, actually, we're the ones going to be planning for the long term. We're thinking beyond what even the government is planning. And that's what makes him special. Yeah.
So, as an Indian, I am tempted to ask you the obvious question, that why did he succeed? Did he succeed because of the restriction on foreign companies, or did he have the right connections?
Well, the reason I wrote this book and not a book about Baidu, which is, as you know, sort of China's Google, very quickly in that story, you would have had to start writing about things like the Great Firewall of China. Now, India's blessed, frankly, that you don't have to open VPNs to get on the globe, the world's greatest sites. In fact, there's a bad joke going around Beijing right now that the president-elect Trump seems to be announcing policy about China, for example, on Twitter, which is blocked in China. So President Xi Jinping cannot actually respond. Of course, they all have their own VPNs, but at some point, it reveals the cost of this firewall and also the credibility issue, because Baidu has many interesting technologies and has many interesting products, but there's always that question: would they be what they are today without the firewall? Now, Google was not blocked early on, and famously, Google left China on its own accord, dealing with censorship issues and things like that. If you visit Baidu's headquarters in Beijing, the first thing they show you is a certificate by their founder, Robin Li, which allegedly was filed 2 months before the Google guys had founded their own patent. Robin Li, who'd been a student in the US, had filed. So it eats at them that people think, oh, you're just a copycat, you're benefiting from government censorship and so on. And they're trying to become a leader in things like automotive, self-driving cars, and AI. They have a big lab, Baidu, in Silicon Valley. But there's always this question, what would they be without government protection? The reason I wrote this book, to answer your question, is Alibaba is about e-commerce fundamentally. That has not been a particularly sensitive area. I mean, whether people buy things or not, it's not going to change the regime, So that's how they started. And I think that his story is, therefore, I think we can say there's a big merit in that. And I wrote a lot about eBay, how he took them on and defeated them. And it was actually the sheer incompetence often of the Silicon Valley companies that really comes out of that story. Jack couldn't believe his luck at how incompetent some of his competitors were.
So since you're on that topic, so why do you think that all the American titans failed where he succeeded?
2 words: conference call. And those of you who live in India know, because when I've been in Asia a long time, we get to stay up until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to do these calls, so that Mr. Smith, or whoever in New York or California can do it, mid-morning before lunch. So, I joke, but the ability of competing in a highly entrepreneurial market against very powerful local entrepreneurs who are owners of their businesses. So Jack, he's no longer the CEO, but he's the chairman of Alibaba. Similarly, Robin Li, he's the CEO of Baidu and others. How can you send somebody as a vice president, Asian region, for example, to sit opposite these guys and negotiate, and of course deal with the government and other issues? In the US, it's all about getting the corporate council to sign off on things. And there's an old joke in China, you just get on with things. You do things and ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission first. If you wait for permission, it'll never happen. Now, in some cases, there is genuine corporate governance issues, ethics, of course. But it's just very hard to manage through lawyers, through conference calls. And I think that's what the whole Alibaba experience shows. And by the way, Meg Whitman, who actually had a quite early connection to China, and should be given credit that she saw the opportunity in China long before others. She now, at Stanford, she came and said, I regret actually, we backed a local entrepreneur, and I write about him, a very talented Chinese individual who should have been on this cover, a guy called Xiao Yibo, who was a really early e-commerce player. But eBay invested, and then they took majority control. an interest for India, at least, Alibaba is saying we don't want to kind of take away from local entrepreneurs. We'll see how that goes, but there's a genuine sense that entrepreneurs should run the business. And Alibaba, as it expands, is talking about backing them. They've seen how the Americans came and basically took the business away from the local entrepreneurs, and it all it fell apart very quickly.
Okay, this particular book of yours is also, in a way, a story of the Chinese economic expansion.
Yes.
And with all your expertise, so I mean, it would be interesting to hear your perspective on this particular point.
Mm-hmm.
So,
to be honest, there's a bit of trickery in this book, is that Alibaba and Jack's face is the sugar. We all want to read about billionaires, like how the heck did they do it? But I hope in the book there are some vegetables, some nutritious things which will be good for you for the long term. One, when that stuff I was telling you about Zhejiang, I think we need to understand more, not just China as a whole entity, but within China, what's going on. Particularly places like Zhejiang, I could also talk about Jiangsu, or clusters inland, like Chengdu, or now Shenzhen. We need to break it down. We can't just keep talking about China top down. There's a lot of things happening within China, and specifically the rise of the private sector, the rise of the entrepreneurial spirit. That's one big theme in the book, as well as how the internet came to China. I mean, it's still somewhat surprising that the internet is so large in China, almost 3 times the US internet population going on. Because the Chinese government made an early decision, when I first moved there actually in the mid-90s, to create informatization. Everything is made in China, including the English language. So there's a new word called informatization. This is Chinese government's view of putting a broadband connection in every table, rather like Henry IV of France, who wanted a chicken on every Sunday dinner table. The Chinese government has said, look, we want people to have access to technology. And actually, I had a business in India about 10 years ago in Delhi trying to look at how China did it. It's very different because the Chinese state telecom companies are state-owned, right? But that was the basis for the entrepreneurs they talked about to suddenly get scale. I mean, entrepreneurs have been around, as we've seen, for a couple of decades in China, but often they were very small scale. They were often disconnected from markets. The internet has been the glue, if you will, that has joined up and propelled them increasingly to become global players. I showed you that map earlier of Zhejiang and the town called Wenzhou. People from Wenzhou are very wealthy and seen as very early property speculators in China. If you try to buy an apartment in Shanghai or Beijing, the Wenzhou people have got here already. But now, if you try and buy an apartment in Palo Alto or London, they'll be there too. So we need to understand that these entrepreneurs now have wings. They have capital. And by the way, there's a lot of capital flooding out of China. In fact, overnight, there was a rumor that the renminbi had dropped 8%, which turned out to be I don't know what was going on. But there's a sense that entrepreneurs now, we need to understand who they are. So the book is an element of East versus West. The rise of Asia, particularly in this case, Alibaba, a symbol of the Chinese internet, taking on, in some cases, humiliating the West, Silicon Valley. But I think the more interesting theme for the future is North versus South. Beijing, political control of the Communist Party in Beijing, and yet the economic muscle, if you will, increasing in the South. So how does the Communist Party negotiate that tension with entrepreneurs? And how does that change how we see China? Because when we think of China, I often say we might think of the Chinese embassy, flags flying, symbols of state, military. Of course, in India, there's other associations, But if we think of Chinatown, or Chinese food, or Chinese shops, it's a more positive thing. Chinese food is very popular in India, right? So in a sense, I think Alibaba, to some extent, is part of that soft power that is accruing to entrepreneurs, the private sector. And it's very interesting to see how much Beijing will enable that and allow that to happen, because it might actually be in their interest.
So here there's an interesting anecdote relating to him, where he was offered Alibaba shares at, I think, 30 cents.
You're going to reveal my, okay.
Which he refused. So,
yeah.
So my perspective on that is, while the winner takes it all, the loser becomes an author.
Yes. So yes, I did, so in my defense, I'm half Scottish, so I'm very cheap. And I wasn't given the shares, I was given a warrant to buy the shares. And this was in 2000. The warrant was expiring in early 2003, and I didn't really go into too much detail, but Alibaba's first business was a B2B business. It wasn't that great. Jack was exciting and all that, but I wasn't that convinced. Actually, just a few months after my options expired, he launched Taobao, which became this amazing website where they defeated eBay, 9 million merchants on it. So, yes, had I exercised, bought those shares for $50,000, today would have been worth, I think, 35 million. So I'd like to thank anybody who buys my book. I'll be on book tour for the rest of my life. And no, but I think it's a sign that if you come across people who are exceptional in your life, maybe suspend disbelief a little bit, because Jack had these crazy claims. When I first met him in '99, I will defeat eBay, I will defeat Amazon, and by the way, here's my apartment, and this is us. You know? So he had this crazy combination of ambition, but also humility. What I liked about him struck me as very different from the very show-off, braggadocio kind of entrepreneurs back then. He was different. He's very humble, still to this day. He talks about, I'm just a little guy, I'm trying to do my best. There was something special about that. Yes, I should have bought those shares. Yeah. By the way, one thing, if you make a big mistake in your life, here's some advice. So, during my research, I found out that my colleague, actually, Shirley Lin from Morgan Stanley, she had moved to Goldman, and Goldman Sachs was the first investor in Alibaba. In 1999, they bought half of the company for $5 million, just around the time that I'd met Jack. 3 years later, also they lost faith in Alibaba. So Goldman, Shirley had left actually, Goldman sold their stake in Alibaba for about $20 million. That stake today would be worth about $125 billion. So my loss by comparison to Goldman is just nothing, you know. So my book is a feel-good story about Goldman Sachs not making money. So they're probably after me now. And now they're in government again. It's scary, but no. So yeah, if you make a big mistake, find somebody who's made a much bigger one. You'll feel fine. And write a book.
So interesting. So in terms of, so you know, this Jack Ma has been termed as a god.
Yeah.
And on the other end of the spectrum, he's been termed as a madman. So what are the management lessons that anyone can draw from this personality, this interesting personality? I mean, suggest a few.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to come up one recipe for success in any venture, and I wouldn't expect anybody to try to be Jack, because you'd have to sort of go back in time in a way. You'd have to find all these crazy inefficiencies that now kind of seem obvious about retail and finance. But that doesn't explain him enough. I think, you know, his determination, his consistency, but also his charisma. It's very important. I mean, if you're one person, you know, Don Quixote tilting at windmills, that's fine. But you need an army if you're going to do what Jack has done. And he was able to bring people to his side, I think, through his charm. And in the second chapter I call Jack Magic, because it's not my term, but early people working for him described him as like a magician. You know, he has this, I consider him part Irish, like he has Blarney, this ability to charm people, like, you know, like Bill Clinton, who's a close friend, you know. The two of them on stage, actually, in an audience like this, everybody would think, oh, he's talking just to me, you know, and there'd be 5,000 people in the room. Bill Clinton has that charisma. Jack Ma has that charisma. And he has that in English as well as Chinese, which is important. I also think of him as almost part Jewish, because he's got chutzpah, this ability to just take crazy risks and just get out there, that street merchant kind of thing. So I think it's an interesting combination. He's atypically Chinese. I mean, he has always had this English language thing from a very early age. He's been influenced by people, as I mentioned, like Jack Welch, also Chinese martial arts novelists. So every employee of Alibaba had to take a martial arts nickname, and they still engage a lot in martial arts, and it's sort of fantasy world. And he also is very inspired by Forrest Gump. So I mentioned earlier the whale and the shrimp versus the ants and things. He has this idea that you can, almost like Voltaire, you know, just kind of bumble through life and be lucky and happy. And you know, I think not worrying too much. I mean, being strategic but not getting down, you know, and that inspires people around him. So in that picture, we saw Jack's wife, but there had been, you know, 16 others who had worked with Jack. Many of them had gone through all the other ventures too, and actually followed him, even to Beijing, working for the government. They would move to Beijing to be with him. A bit like Brian in Life of Brian, you know, he's sort of like an almost disciple-like. But he's not doing it through, unlike Steve Jobs, you know, he's not doing it through shaming people or scaring people. He tends to appeal to people's better nature, and his sense of humor is a big part of his leadership. So he's strategic, and yet he has that charisma. So it's an unusual combination.
It's difficult to describe.
Yeah.
That's the way.
Takes a book.
Okay. So coming back to the specific point about, you know, e-commerce and social issues, social disruptions.
Yeah.
How has that been tackled in China? Because we fear in India, I mean, the traders, the pop and mom stores, I mean, have a lot of fear. And being a democracy, we do have this challenge of, significant influence of such aspects, impacting decisions on e-commerce?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, Chinese retail wasn't particularly organized. I mean, there were state providers, but really very unappetizing products. They weren't particularly well, connected. I mean, in theory, they were connected because they're government, but it wasn't really a thriving sector. So there was no big pushback by organized retail against e-commerce. And it was so quickly adopted by people that it was hard to do that. The same is true in finance, except the banks have been pushing back against Alibaba. So one example, Alipay, which I mentioned is part of this iron triangle, where you can pay online using escrow. Jack, a few years ago, started saying, you have money in your Alipay account. We call it leftover wallet account. We're going to give you a new account. You can get 2% higher rates of interest than the banks, just for some spare change. $120 billion suddenly flooded into that spare change account. It became the 5th largest money market fund in the world. And the banks were just shocked and said it's the first time they've ever had competition on that scale. It's still small compared to the overall reserves. But there's an example of some tension that came, and Jack had to pull back a bit. The banks put in restrictions. The same has been happening offline. The Chinese Prime Minister, a guy called Li Keqiang, talks a lot about the Internet plus economy. The Internet will be driving China's growth forward. China needs to move away from export. They need to promote consumption. But the president of China, Xi Jinping, we don't hear him talking so much about that. And there's a general sense that he's more concerned about layoffs, people who are losing their jobs. And one interesting factoid, Didi, which is the Uber of China, now even Uber has sold its stake to Didi, employs, by one estimate from the Wall Street Journal, I think close to 300,000 drivers who are former military personnel. Xi Jinping, one of his signature reforms is reforming China's military, which means a lot of layoffs, because China had way too many sort of foot soldiers, if you will. So the internet can be a sponge, also. These ride-sharing economy can create jobs as well as destroy. So it's a very sensitive topic in China as elsewhere. Very interesting, it's now breaking down. In Beijing and Shanghai, local governments are saying, you know what, if you're going to be a driver in our town, you need to be a local resident. And in China, it's very important you have something called the hukou, which allows you to send your kids to school. And they basically now, it's what we call NIMBYism, right? They're not in my backyard. They're not allowing migrants to come in and do. So, it's the logic of this one national China, everything's government is breaking down to some degree. So, but there is a lot of debate about this. But generally, I think people are welcoming, the consumers are welcoming this because they're not seeing shops that they really loved shut down. What they're seeing is shopping malls are beginning to empty out. If you go to Beijing and Shanghai now, a lot of the shopping malls are being repurposed as food courts. Because food is the one thing people in office complexes want to go out and eat, but increasingly, people just order online. The convenience of this. In Beijing and Shanghai and other places, you'll see these little electric vehicles. By the way, if you cross the street in China, be very careful, because you can't hear these vehicles, but they're everywhere. And these are the cat that I showed you. They'll have a cat for Tmall. Its principal rival, JD, has a dog. So you have these dog and cat vehicles like going everywhere. You'll see them pull up outside buildings. China's very high density population, so they can hit a whole tower block very easily, or office tower. People will come outside and start trying on clothes, for example, that they've ordered. Maybe they've ordered 5 jumpers. And they'll try 5, they'll return 3, because you have 7 days to return without question. So it's almost like your personal wardrobe is just following you around, So in a sense, that's better than anything they'd ever experienced. So I think China has a uniqueness in that it's more likely to go for the new, the modern, because of the, communism and sort of state planning, it had skewed the economy. So that's different from places that have a tradition of family-owned shops and service. There was that too, but not on the scale that we see in India, for example.